And now, you are about to have a masterclass in craftsmanship as I present the one, the only, the illustrious showstopper, Dannie.
Dear audience, I'm a poet. I'm extremely good at making words sound beautiful, taking complex objects and making them seem nice and simple. But one of the things that I struggle with is hiding behind my work. It's extremely easy to write about things that border on the line of fiction and nonfiction because no one really knows. But today, I decided to tell you a story. So back in the 90s, sometime around 1993, before I had any conception of Nickelodeon, and right after my mother, my father, and myself bought our first home. Back then, life was extremely simple because I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. The extent of my playtime took place in the driveway, period. The driveway was the extent of my playtime, and my favorite toy was my Power Wheels truck. Erased. Capital T, truck. Mine was a Bigfoot. I would be so happy when my father would let me drive it up and down the driveway as often as he would. And even when it rained, he would take his car out of the garage so I can drive it around inside while it was pouring down rain. What I eventually started to realize is that is when I started copying my father, because my father loved cars. Whatever I saw my father do with his car, I wanted to do with my Bigfoot. If I saw him get underneath his car, I got underneath my Bigfoot. If I saw him washing his car, if I saw him washing his car, I was washing my Bigfoot. If he was using a wrench on his car, I was trying to find a place to use a wrench on my Bigfoot. That's how much I admired my dad. Eventually, I got to the age where I was in grade school, and I realized that children like to tell lots of lies. Actually, let me go back. So my dad was an electrical mechanic. He was really good at working on things with his hands and doing things around the house. That was actually how he got my mom. So sometime back in the 70s, my mom was stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire. And my dad just happened to see her, and he stopped to help. And that's how we got to the 90s. So now I can get back to my original point. So in grade school, everybody knows that kids tell fibs. There was the one kid that said they had $1 million house in a middle-class neighborhood. And at the time, we all thought it was so true. But my fib was having a go-kart. I wanted a go-kart so bad, but I never got the opportunity to get one. However, I decided that I was going to build a go-kart. So I used to get all of these catalogs with lawnmower engines and parts and think, I'm going to build me a go-kart. Didn't happen that way. But eventually, I became of age to drive my own car. And so the first thing I did was hooked up my stereo. You see, I had an uncle that was into loud music. Every time me and my cousin used to ride with him, we would always hear the bumpity bump, 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 bump in the car. And so I knew as soon as I got my own car, I had to have my own stereo. So I got to the point where I started to become more independent because previously I would always look towards my dad and do everything that he did. But now that I had my own car, I could do what I wanted to do with my own car. But my dad was still there for me. So when I ordered all of my stereo equipment, my dad still spent every single Saturday helping me wire up everything, cutting holes in my car to insert new speakers. And I still appreciated him, even though I was starting to carve my own path. And so I had to listen to a lot of rap music, right? The stereotype for black men. So my song of choice was T.I., Top, Back. I like my beat down low, down low, down low, down low, down low, down low, down low. I like my top laid back, laid back, laid back, laid back, laid back, laid back. Hey, holla if you like your beat down low, down low, down low, down low, down low, down low, down low. I like my top laid back, laid back. Whoop, whoop, whoop. The sound of the police. It was a Saturday night around 11 p.m., 2 black males in a car, a dark car at that. One of them eventually became a felon. I was nervous because this was only the second time I'd ever been pulled over. The first time was in broad daylight, but this was in the middle of Velda Village, one of those municipalities that was known for pulling over people just because. All of the ticketing practices, all of the stopping people to check for their insurance, and it seemed like that's what they were doing, but they really weren't doing that. This is where I was. So luckily, nothing happened. The officer let us go with the ticket and without incident. But when I told my dad what happened, he gave me $125, half of the $250 for the ticket. So with the first ticket I got, my dad told me that he would pay the entire price of the ticket. And this wasn't because I was the only child, this because my dad wanted to teach me a lesson. He told me that sometimes people end up in jail for the most trivial things, and they can actually end up dead. And he didn't want this to happen to me. So the first ticket, he told me he would pay full price. The second one, he told me he would give me half. And the third one, and from there forward, I was on my own. I was incredibly grateful for this lesson. So the final lesson that I got from my father when he was around was buying my first car on my own with my own money as a working adult, because my first ones were hand-me-downs. Even though I knew exactly what kind of car I wanted, he made sure that I got a reliable car. He didn't want me to have any issues because I dealt with a lot of unreliable cars and having to go to the shop over and over and over again. But also there were times that we would work on the car together in the driveway, and those are memories that I cherish. I was grateful. However, one day, probably maybe 7 years into having this car, roughly 100,000 miles, my car actually had done pretty good. It was reliable. However, I had an issue. I'm on my way to Kansas City, and then all of a sudden, my car just stopped just outside of Columbia. I was stranded on the highway for 4 hours because it took that long for the insurance company to send a tow truck. The first thing that happened was I was scared. I was thinking about how at the time I didn't have a job. And when you don't have a job, the first thing that comes to mind is, how much is this going to cost me? If it's an engine, it's going to be thousands. The second thing was, I'm in the middle of nowhere. There are so many thoughts that went through my mind, but the first one was, what would my father do? I wanted so badly to be able to pick up that phone and call my dad, because my dad always had the right answer for everything. But that wasn't the case. However, there was one lesson that my father gave me many years ago. He told me to always have faith in God. So I did that. And with God's guidance, things started to happen. So as I was on my phone with my mother, she said, "You're halfway there. You might as well rent a car and keep on going." And so that's what I did. And so eventually I get my car towed to the dealership, and the dealership said, "Hey, if this is what we think it is, this problem is probably going to be covered under warranty, which means it's going to be absolutely free." The next thing, I needed a rental car to get to Kansas City. They said they were out of rental cars, but they can take me to Enterprise. And so they took me to Enterprise. They said they had one car left. And I had that one car, and I was able to make it to Kansas City right on time and never miss a beat from my original plan, thanks to God. And so by the time I got back home, I pulled into my driveway, the same driveway that saw me driving my Power Wheels, the same driveway that saw me working on my first car stereo, and I thought about how fortunate I was to have a father like mine. Thank you for listening, audience.